A few years ago, a friend of mine asked if I wanted to run a half marathon with him. At that point, my accumulated running time, life to date, was probably 5 hours, most of which I did back in high school during PE. So I wasn't what you might consider a conditioned athlete. Still, a half marathon sounded doable. After all, it was just half, right? Seemed easy enough. Well, I'm pretty sure that easy run shortened my life. I can't even say I ran a half marathon. It was more like a tenth. I mostly walked, trying to catch my breath. I got the t-shirt at the end, and it wasn't even a noble gain. I realized that a marathon wasn't just something I could jump into, even a half. If I wanted to complete the run, let alone compete in the run, I would need to condition myself first. So I signed up for another half marathon, this time 6 months in advance. And during that 6 months, I began to build my endurance. First, it wasn't easy. I started out small, running a half mile, then a mile. Over time, I began to run farther and faster. Breathing while running became easier. Soon, I was setting a new record for myself each week. And then I got to run my second half marathon, and it was a completely different experience. I was keeping pace with a lot of the runners. I felt confident. I even felt like I deserved that commemorative t-shirt. See, I already knew this, but that moment really solidified it for me. If something is worth doing, it's probably not easily or quickly accomplished. It requires perseverance. Now, we'd probably all agree that there's value in slowing down, waiting, and not being in too much of a hurry. I mean, if you have a son or a daughter who really wants to get married, you'd still tell him or her, that doesn't mean you just marry the first person who shows interest in you, right? You tell them to take their time and make sure things are right before they plunge into a super serious relationship. At the same time, we all know that waiting isn't easy. Just because we tell our kids to be patient doesn't mean that it's any easier for us to be patient, right? Even though we know that being an impatient driver increases our chances of getting in a wreck, it doesn't change the fact that we're still impatient drivers. Plus, the culture we live in doesn't help. Slowing down and not being in a hurry isn't in our cultural DNA. Years ago, there was a time when people didn't have a choice but to slow down. A couple hundred years ago, in a pre-industrial, pre-technological society, slowing down and waiting was just what people did. These days, the speed of life around us has increased the speed of life within us. As a result, our threshold of waiting has decreased. This isn't a knock on our current society, it's simply what it is. But it's important for us to understand that things like waiting and slowing down aren't going to come naturally to us or be encouraged by the world around us. When everything around us pushes us to go after what's next, it's difficult for us to simply stay with what's already in front of us. So, how do we press on when everything around us tells us to move on? Well, to discover what it looks like to persevere, we're going to be reading from the Old Testament book of Exodus. Specifically, we're going to look at the Israelites' journey from captivity in Egypt to the freedom of the Promised Land. And some of you may be familiar with the story. At this point in history, the Israelites were the people who God chose to make his own. God initially led them into Egypt to escape a terrible famine. But while they were there, the Egyptians eventually forced the Israelites into laboring for them. For hundreds of years, God's people cried out to him for help. Eventually, God sent a man named Moses to lead them out of captivity. Through Moses, God miraculously set his people free and then told them he would take them to an incredible land of their own, a land he referred to as the Promised Land. But the journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land took way longer than it should have. And along the way, the Israelites started to lose hope and faith in God. Their wilderness journey shows us some things that we should do, and even more things we shouldn't do if we want to be people who press on and persevere in life. At one point in their journey, God led Moses to the top of Mount Sinai to give him instructions on how the Israelites could connect with God through worship and how they should treat each other. This was also the moment when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. Meanwhile, back at the Israelite camp, people were getting impatient. And this is what's recorded in the Old Testament book of Exodus. When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. "Come on," they said, "make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt." Now, nearly all these people had been around when the Israelites were miraculously delivered out of Egypt. Moses meeting with God on Mount Sinai happened only a few months later, so the people were well aware of what God was capable of. But throughout their journey in the wilderness, they began to suffer from some serious spiritual amnesia. Moses had been gone for a while, and they assumed that their leader was dead. So they told Aaron, Moses' right-hand man, "Make us some gods who can lead us." In other words, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Now, before we're too quick to judge, let's be real enough to admit that we can do the same thing from time to time. If it takes too long for God to bring certain relationships into our lives, whether it be friends or for those of us who are single, someone to date, we'll just settle for whoever happens to be in front of us. We'll rush to pacify our loneliness. Or maybe we quit before God has a chance to work in our situation. For example, we may be praying for our job environment to improve, but if it doesn't improve instantly or on our timeline, we'll quit before we see what God can do. Or maybe we'll say yes to business deals before we even pray about them. Or maybe we'll blurt out advice to our children instead of waiting on God to open up the right time to talk. The book of Proverbs says, "Timely advice is lovely, like golden apples in a silver basket." Most of our parenting doesn't wait on the timely part of that, and it certainly doesn't get the golden apples in a silver basket. Now, back to the Israelites. Aaron finally gave in to the impatient Israelites and had a calf idol forged out of gold brought to him by the people. And things continued to slide downhill quickly. Aaron saw how excited the people were, so he built an altar in front of the calf. Then he announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to the Lord." The people got up early the next morning to sacrifice burnt offerings and peace offerings. After this, they celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. God's people literally started worshiping a God that wasn't their God, or a God for that matter. Their shallow commitment to God and their leader, Moses, was exposed, and chaos ensued. While God was giving Moses instructions on Mount Sinai about worshiping him, they had already moved on to worshiping something else. God's first command was, "You must not have any other God but me." The Israelites broke the first command before it even made it off the mountain. They impatiently moved on from the true God to a golden calf. But truthfully, we all have things that we move on to as well, don't we? We have things that we'll distract ourselves with and give our attention to instead of waiting on God to work. Look at what the psalmist said about the Israelites. "But they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his plan to unfold. In the desert, they gave into their craving. In the wilderness, they put God to the test." They didn't wait because waiting is uncomfortable and it can make us feel helpless. So instead of waiting on God, they impatiently gave into their craving. And listen, it's always more difficult to wait than it is to not wait. But as much as we may resist waiting, the reality is that it's part of how God develops deep faith and strong character inside of us. Which reminds me of another verse from the King James Bible. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." Not being weary and worn out, but instead having a renewed strength. Not fainting and quitting, but instead having wings like eagles. Doesn't this sound great? Isn't this what we all want? Well, we get it when we learn to wait on God. And that's because perseverance requires patience. As the Holy Spirit works on the inside of us, more patience will be seen on the outside of us, including the ability to press on. Considering this truth, here are 2 ways we can live out this reality. First, pray before you act. There's a man named Terry Looper who wrote a book called Sacred Pace. As a successful businessman, he had a nervous breakdown at the age of 36. And in response, he went to counseling and gave his life to God. He came to realize that he was addicted to deal making and people pleasing, and that money had become his God. Being raised in a family where love felt conditional, he felt the need to continually achieve and accumulate in order to prove his worth. After his breakthrough, he started a new company with 2 rules for himself. 1, only work 40 hours a week. And 2, don't have any sales goals. It's now a $1 billion energy company that continues to receive awards for being a company of excellence. In his book, he talks about his #1 rule for every day and every decision: consult with my friend Jesus. He talks about deals that he prayed about for years before formalizing, and they were deals that he formally would have agreed to immediately. What if we did the same thing? What if we slowed down, prayed, and waited on God before we acted? Wouldn't that also save us from a lot of regret? And the second thing we can do is this: we can worship in the waiting. What if the Israelites had worshiped the true God instead of a golden calf while they were waiting? What if they decided to press in and grow closer to God? I know some single people who want to get married who have developed incredible depth and godliness in the midst of their waiting. It's so inspiring. And just like every waiting period is an opportunity for us to be impatient and bitter, it's also an opportunity for us to be patient and worship God. Perseverance requires patience. Not only will patience give us the ability to press on, it will also make us more pleasant to be around. An increase of patience will help us in every area of our lives. So my friends, let's remember, perseverance requires patience.